The black automobiles that chugged and sputtered their way down the streets of New York and other cities represented the latest in American technology. During the 1920s, the Ford Model T automobile, like the Macy's Parade, would become a fixture of American life. The first cars appeared in America in the late 1800s, but they remained a toy for the rich through the early 1900s. That changed when a young entrepreneur, Henry Ford, began selling his Model T in 1908. It wasn't much to look at, however, it changed American society forever. Imagine how expensive cars would be today if everyone were custom made. Ford began making his cars identical and simple. That brought the cost down, but not enough. So he studied manufacturing processes, from interchangeable parts to the moving belts and meat packing plants that brought the work to the workers. Then he hired scientific management expert Frederick Winslow Taylor to determine how workers should move and at what speed to be most productive. These ideas combined to produce the first large-scale moving assembly line, a production system in which the item being built moves along a conveyor belt to various workstations. On Ford's assembly line, each worker had one of 84 specific jobs, often requiring simple skills. Ford explained, "The man who puts on a bolt does not put on a nut. The man who puts on the nut does not tighten it." In its first year, the Ford assembly line produced a car every hour and a half. The car sold for under $500, about half the cost of the first Model Ts. The price was not cheap in its day, but many people could afford it. By the 1920s, Ford was rolling out a car every minute, and the price had dropped even lower. By 1929, about 22 million cars bumped along the nation's mostly unpaved roads. People loved the Model T. They wrote songs about it. They formed automobile driving clubs. Ford realized that his workers were also potential buyers. He raised his workers' pay to $5 a day, far above average factory wages. This enabled his workers to buy cars. Workers did pay a price, however. Ford bitterly opposed unions and dealt ruthlessly with anyone who tried to organize workers. Organizers pointed out the boring, repetitive tasks in Ford's clockwork-like assembly lines. One labor leader remarked, "Ford workers are not really alive. They are half dead." During the first quarter of the century, the Ford Motor Company dominated automaking. In the 1920s, more than half the cars in the United States were Fords. Competitors such as General Motors and Chrysler tried to improve on Ford's formula. In an effort to keep costs low, Ford refused to change the Model T's design until 1927, after some 15 million had rolled off the assembly line. New competitors, General Motors and Chrysler, rose to challenge that formula, bringing out new designs and colors each year. Competition helped the entire industry grow. Other industries also learned from Ford. Manufacturers of all kinds of consumer goods began using assembly line techniques to make goods in large quantities and at lower cost. In the 1920s, productivity rose by 60%. Productivity is a measure of output per unit of input such as labor. American workers were producing more in less time. The success of business in the 1920s led to a growth of what is called welfare capitalism, a system in which companies provide benefits to employees in an effort to promote worker satisfaction and loyalty. For example, many companies offered company-paid pensions, payments made to workers when they retire. Others set up recreation programs for workers. In return, business owners hoped that welfare capitalism would encourage workers to shun unions and accept lower pay. Many did. Every time motorists turned the crank to start their cars, other industries benefited. Demand for steel, glass, rubber, and other automobile materials soared. Automobile repair shops and filling stations sprang up in cities and towns. Motels and restaurants arose to meet the needs of car travelers. The simple engines ran on gasoline, byproduct of petroleum. A few of the landowners who found petroleum on their property became rich practically overnight. Automaking put the city of Detroit, Michigan on the map. Henry Ford based his manufacturing operations there, and other car makers followed. In 1910, fewer than 500,000 people lived in Detroit. Within 20 years, the population had tripled. The growth in manufacturing caused a boom in other Midwest cities. Akron, Ohio, the center of the rubber and tire industry, grew from fewer than 70,000 people in 1910 to nearly 210,000 in 1920. For the decade, it was the fastest growing city in the United States. As cities grew, so did their suburbs, the smaller towns located outside urban areas. Many suburbs have been established since the late 1800s, thanks in part to the construction of trolley lines that carried workers back and forth between home and workplace. Car travel, however, allowed people to live at even greater distances from their jobs. Trolley enterprises, however, suffered during the 1920s as suburbs expanded. Freedom to travel also produced a new tourist industry. Before the auto boom, Florida had a few resorts that attracted mainly wealthy visitors. Automobiles brought tourists by the thousands to discover warm, sunny Florida. Buyers snatched up land, causing prices to rise sharply. Some Florida swamps were drained to put up new housing. During the 1920s, Americans witnessed an explosion of new products, new experiences, and new forms of mass communication on a scale never seen before. People were getting into the buying habit and liking it. Companies were happy to supply more new products for them to buy. Using cost-efficient new manufacturing processes, factories turned out a variety of new electrical appliances such as refrigerators and vacuum cleaners. The electrification of new areas of the country enabled more people to use the latest home conveniences. Perhaps the favorite new electric home technology was the radio. By the end of the 1920s, 4 homes in 10 had a radio, like the televisions and computers that followed it. The radio opened new worlds to American families. Now families gathered in the evenings to hear news from around the world, as well as dramas and comedy shows. Radio connected the world as never before. So did a new form of public transportation, the airplane. Aviation had made great advances during World War I. The first passenger airplanes appeared over American skies in the 1920s. The early flights offered little comfort. Some passengers wore goggles and helmets. Planes were uninsulated and unpressured. They couldn't fly over mountains or at night. In fact, for cross-country travel, trains were more comfortable as well as cheaper. For some Americans, though, the thrill of air travel outweighed the early discomforts. Buy, buy, buy. On the sidelines of the great American spending spree, advertisers became the cheerleaders. During the 1920s, persuasive advertising gained a major role in the economy. Advertisers paid for space in publications. Companies sponsored popular radio shows, such as the Palmolive Hour and the Maxwell House Concert. Advertising money made these publications and shows available to the public, and advertising gave wide exposure to consumer products. In the early 1900s, most Americans paid for items in full when they bought them. They might borrow money to buy a house, a piano, or a sewing machine. But as one economist noted, people who made such purchases didn't talk about them. Borrowing money was not considered respectable. Setting the stage for today's credit card society, the generation of the 1920s turned to installment buying, paying for an item over time in small payments. They bought on credit, which is, in effect, borrowing money. Consumers took quickly to installment buying to purchase the new products on the market. By the end of the decade, 90% of durable goods or long-lasting goods, such as cars and appliances, were bought on credit. Advertisements encouraged the use of credit, telling consumers they could get what they want now and assuring them that with small payments, they would barely miss the money. The era that brought the boom in cars, consumer goods, radio, and advertising earned the nickname the Roaring Twenties. The name captured a certain excitement of the times. Today, however, historians tend to avoid that nickname because it gives the false impression that all Americans were prosperous and freewheeling. In fact, many Americans suffered deeply in the post-war period. American farmers experienced good times during World War I. Demand for their products was high and competition from European farmers was low. After the war, however, demand slowed and European farmers returned to their fields. A glut of farm products hit the market. As a result, U.S. farm prices plunged and American farmers entered a decade of extreme hardship. Farm failures increased. The income of farmers and even the value of farmland declined. The federal government tried to help. A 1921 tariff made foreign farm products more expensive, which helped raise prices for U.S. products. Yet these measures failed to fully relieve the problems. In some places, nature added to farmers' woes. An infestation of an insect called the boll weevil destroyed cotton crops throughout the South. Disaster also struck the South in 1927 when the great Mississippi River flooded. Up to 1,000 people died and countless more were left homeless. In Florida, the wildland boom came to a sudden and disastrous end. Demand for land peaked and then collapsed. Then came the big blow, the strongest hurricane recorded to that time. The hurricane had winds of 150 miles per hour and it killed 243 people. For people who heard the warning on South Florida's only radio station, the hurricane was one of the most destructive ever. As a result, Florida sunk into an economic depression as even other parts of the nation enjoyed prosperity. Okay, now I need you to go back to classjump.com and answer the question, how did the economy change after World War I ended in the United States? Give me at least 2 examples.